The theorist that I work with closely and I heavily draw on is Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist, and he's renowned for his work on social theory. I draw on his work because he effectively draws out the relationships between power and equity and human relationships. In Bourdieu's work, he conceptualises a theory of social practice, which we call a theory of social practice. And within that theory of social practice, there are three major components. The first component is the idea of capital. And capital basically is the way in which humans exchange knowledge and friendships and networks. And capital is very important because without capital, we can't learn from each other, we can't work together, and we don't communicate. The second concept of Bourdieu's theory of practice is this notion of habitus. And habitus is essentially what we as individuals bring to a social context or bring into an idea. And the third very important concept is this notion of field. And field is basically just the place in which human activity operates. So within these three key ideas, Bourdieu carefully intersects each one of them across each other. And from his work, we can apply his understandings to early childhood education in various ways. But for me, his work is exceptionally relevant to the issues facing young children and families who are from culturally and linguistically diverse families, particularly those families who find themselves in marginalised positions. So for my work, which is essentially looking at the relationship between language and culture and identity and social justice, particularly in relation to bilingualism and language retention, I'm very interested in why it is that young children, as they enter early childhood settings coming from a bilingual background, where they may speak one or two or three languages and or dialects at home, as when they enter into an English-speaking dominant environment, they very often reject the use of their home language. By the time children get to primary school, very often they have lost the use of their home language and they have no expressive ability to use their home language. So I'm very interested in what actually happens, what processes are taking place between the time they enter early childhood from a very young age to the time they leave early childhood prior to school settings and go to school, where they've started out being potentially bilingual or multilingual, and they often enter kindergarten with only one language, and that is English. So for my research and the kinds of investigation that I'm involved in, I think Bourdieu is a very useful and solid conceptual framework because he sets out ways in which we can understand how power, particularly power that is institutionalised, how power actually affects the way children learn, but also how it impacts on the use of language. So Bourdieu's theory of practice helps us educators in early childhood education to understand how schools, community settings and early childhood settings reproduce social and cultural knowledge and power. For Bourdieu, human activity is conceptualised as exchanges that occur within an economy of practice. And these exchanges can yield or not yield material and symbolic profits. Basically what I mean by that is that when we come together as humans, including children, when we interact, we exchange knowledge, we exchange power, and a lot of those interactions are contextualised within a certain situation. So in early childhood education, if we look at Bourdieu's three major components, if we look at the early childhood setting as a field, and we look at children's knowledge systems, their values, their experiences as their capital. And in that we have to also include their languages. And then we look at their individual dispositions, the way they think, the way they operate, their attitudes, whether they're extroverted, whether they're introverted, so their temperament we can call their habitus. So when we look at Bourdieu's three concepts, field, capital and habitus, I can see when I use Bourdieu's work how effectively children and adults can be positioned within marginalised positions or positioned as powerful. So obviously the adults are more powerful over children. And in early childhood settings where English is the legitimate language and the dominant language and very, very often the only language spoken, children coming into these environments who speak other languages, say for instance Arabic or Hindi or Spanish outside, who may have to learn English, will experience for perhaps the very first time in their lives that the knowledge systems, their interactions, their experiences with other humans, other adults, with other children are limited. So they may have experienced outside an early childhood environment, you know, fluent Arabic speaking situations, being able to speak to their parents, to their neighbours, to their cousins, to get things done, to be a very active, powerful individual in various contexts, social contexts. But once entering an English-only early childhood environment, they're rendered powerless because they don't have the dominant language, they don't have the language to make friends, they can't get the teacher's attention, they have to learn the routines. So for me, Bourdieu's work is a very useful framework to look at how early childhood education operates as almost an exclusionary machine that can legitimise English at the expense of other languages. So the habitus are the practices, the perceptions, the dispositions, the attitudes that have formed and shaped our experiences that we have throughout our lifetime. And so from that point of view, we can understand that we are the product of certain histories which are produced in the habitus. So for example, if you've been told all your life that you're this and that, and people around you have told you that, you're very much likely to grow up believing that, and that forms your attitude towards yourself. So it's not self-esteem in that sense, and it's not habit, like I'm in the habit of smoking. It's more about the ways in which we think and feel and operate and perceive things that we've been doing for a very long time, that generates over long periods of time. And it's the way in which we often do things unconsciously. So we all have, those of us who drive cars, we all have different habits in driving. But when some of us have been driving for a long time, the way we drive forms a habitus. We don't even think about what we're doing when we're driving. Many of us now don't even think about what we're doing when we log into our computers, and now it's like our fingers have taken up the habitus for us. So habitus is not just habit, and it's not just unconscious, because it really is a conscious thing as well. Because sometimes you might find yourself saying something or doing something and you might think, well, why did I say that? Why did I think that? I always think that. And that's when the habitus becomes a conscious reflection of our perceptions and our attitudes. So for instance, you go for a job interview and you're nervous and you think, why am I always nervous when I go for a job interview? Well, that is your habitus. That is your perceived experiences, your personal experiences around that particular social context. So for me, the habitus is a very interesting tool to use in my research, because when I looked at the habitus of young bilingual children, I found out that really very often their dispositions and their attitudes towards their home language can be really very positive, but that habitus or that disposition is changeable. So they might be really positive about the use of their language when everybody else is positive, but if they enter into an environment where their language is not spoken, they will shift and adapt their disposition towards speaking English. And we need these dispositions because dispositions assist in our learning. So the habitus, therefore, is a result of the social and the cultural conditions within which it is acquired. Also, for me, the habitus is the ability to respond to cultural norms that are largely determined and regulated depending on where you are located in a culture. So we are all located in different positions within different cultures and within different cultural discourses. The habitus is where you are at, where you are located, how your dispositions operate within that location. So the habitus, the field and capital, those three concepts, each one are very, very different. And it's very important that when we think about Bourdieu's work that we try to always bring together those three key concepts. And very often in early childhood or in education, people talk about capital. There's various different forms of capital. There's cultural capital and linguistic capital, and cultural capital is the knowledge system you have, what you know about things. So obviously a 4-year-old who's been in a childcare centre since the age of 6 months. By the time they get to 4, they have a lot of cultural capital around the routines, around the program, around the ins and outs of that particular program. Whereas a new child coming in at 4 with no English or learning English and Arabic at home, they have very little cultural capital. So therefore we understand that capital and field are very closely tied together. So it's, in one context, you might have very high levels of cultural capital, but that level of cultural capital is not relevant in another context. And I always think about when I travel overseas, very often you've got to go and get your money changed to the local currency. And if you don't do that, you get out at the airport in the country that you're going to, you might have a fistful of Australian dollars, but you haven't got the transfer, you haven't exchanged it. So a lot of kids who are coming into early childhood settings and to primary school settings have a lot of cultural capital, but because it's not valued and it's not taken up, it's not legitimised in early childhood education, that cultural capital is rendered useless. And this is why children go through this exchanging process where they all of a sudden realise, hey, my Arabic's not going to get me friends, it's not going to get me attention, I can't show off how clever I am, etc., etc. So these are very very sad experiences for young children, and they're very limiting for them. Whereas if we look at a field or an early childhood setting where languages are valued and promoted and even taught, those children have opportunities to exchange their knowledge systems. They have opportunities to use their language. And so Bourdieu, theoretically speaking, is really useful for us to see that it's about the ways in which we accumulate knowledge, but it's also about the ways in which we can exchange that knowledge. But that knowledge has to be exchanged and accumulated in particular contexts where it's going to be valued and legitimised.
I'm going to talk about cultural competency, and the interest in this started when we had the opportunity to do some professional development on a subject that related to our role as an inclusion support facilitator. Taking this opportunity was fantastic in regards to looking at cultural competency, because it just opened up so many different concepts, so many complexities that is actually involved in looking at this topic. My initial thoughts of cultural competency had always looked at the concepts within early childhood itself, such as the multicultural perspective, and probably even been influenced by old policies such as assimilation. But this opened up a whole new look into cultural competency, and I started off by actually trying to get some definitions from professional organisations and really looking into the one that is used in the early years learning framework. The one in the early years learning framework is quite extensive. I just felt it didn't get quite into the complexities of what cultural competency, what I was experiencing through my research of cultural competency in my project. I just wanted to share some of the words that are actually used in the definition. It says that cultural competency is evident in everyday practice when educators demonstrate an ongoing commitment to developing their own cultural competence in a two-way process with families and communities, demonstrating the need for building relationships, which is a very complex process within itself. Other words were understanding, respecting, honouring. These words I thought were rather user-friendly, and I did think that the early years learning framework didn't provide a broad enough scope on what cultural competency is. Though when I then looked at the educator's guide that comes out with the early years learning framework, I realised that the framework didn't really want to dictate as to how we do cultural competency, and it gives educators the opportunity to explore this issue themselves, because it is about being aware of your own values and beliefs and the guide does give you the opportunity to start exploring that about yourself. The project on cultural competency went for 12 months, which was fantastic because it gave me the opportunity to look at myself and my values and beliefs, and also keep it in the context of my role and early childhood. I now consider myself previously a fence sitter, where I was happy to listen to points of views and watch practices and not necessarily do anything to challenge them, maybe sometimes not even look at them in a deep manner. But I was also I also started university and going to lectures on Indigenous education. And through that, I started hearing stories that again were creating discomfort. And a quote from the text by Harrison, who was a non-Indigenous teacher going into an Indigenous school, sort of woke me up a little bit to thinking a little bit deeper about some of the things that I see or hear when I am out in children's services. The quote was, "In the end, teachers make a decision about whether they are with or against Indigenous people. Or alternatively, they may not care one way or the other. But remember, the kids will be influenced by the decisions you make." And this really did start me thinking. It was a bit of a catalyst as to looking into cultural competency in a more deeper manner. Asking questions, to me, is very important in cultural competency, whether it's used to clarify, whether it's used to challenge and get people thinking. It starts that process of educators reflecting on what they're doing within their services. I think that's a really good tool to get them started, is to ask those questions. When visiting the children's services as an inclusion support facilitator, part of our role is to provide support for children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And one of the questions for our application is to ask how many children you have that are culturally and linguistically diverse or have these backgrounds. There are a lot of comments that come from this, and one comment was that we have children from South Africa, but they have the same culture as us in Australia. So I started thinking with my cultural competency project, maybe I might have put the cart before the horse. And I also need to look into what people consider culture as being, because I went out there with my view of what culture is, but not really looking at what the services considered culture to be. So I'm hoping my next project will be working with a service, maybe several, and looking at their cultural competence from their understanding of what culture is and having that conversation as well. A clear understanding of what culture is does help, obviously, with understanding what cultural competency is, because these are words in our profession that are given to us. And it's now we have the opportunity through the framework to actually reflect on what these words mean as an individual as well as a group within your team, and as the whole sector itself, to help language it.
I'd like to talk a little bit about funds of knowledge and my experience of using that in collaboration with a group of educators in northern Chile. This concept came from some research in Mexico, and I'm sure many people know a little bit about funds of knowledge, but it's only in the last year or two that I've really researched the theory around funds of knowledge. The theory came out of research that involved researchers going into families' homes, families who were very poor and living in contexts of considerable vulnerability, and the researchers documented the knowledges and literacies that those families practiced. The theory is that that documentation enables these knowledges and literacies to be used in education contexts and enrich the curriculum that children experience. There is a lot of research evidence that documents how marginalised children are excluded from the dominant discourses of education and particularly of schooling. We've used collaboratively in Chile this concept to bridge that gap between the school and the community in which the children are living. And I've been amazed at just how powerful a concept it's been in actually mobilising that interest in working in the community rather than keeping children safe from their own community. A concept that's a really important one in early childhood, and I think there's a real tension for us as a field between that idea of keeping children safe. That is our very first responsibility in the field. But we also have other responsibilities to children about giving them the skill, helping them learn the skills to cope with the daily challenges of their life. And Jonathan Sillen from Bank Street College spoke very powerfully about that in his book. Now that I've begun to think more about this concept, I realise there's a dark side to funds of knowledge. And what is it that educators do with that dark knowledge that exists in communities and the dark experiences that children have? In one of the communities that I've worked with, many children have experienced violence in their homes. How do you work with that fund of knowledge? So I think now there are some big questions for us to take on board that moves what's been a very useful theorisation around family literacies and family knowledge and a way of privileging that knowledge in the curriculum, but now to move on and say, well, who chooses which knowledge and how do we make that decision? So that kind of reflective practice around that.
Increasingly, we see the use of words like and concepts like, and it's not just a word, there's so much that sits behind it, it's a whole way of interacting with people. Words like disadvantaged, words like marginalised, words like vulnerable. And they are words that we need to unpack. They roll off the tongue really easily, especially when we're talking about funding of services. You know, this is a program for disadvantaged families. These are for vulnerable children. By whose definition? When I sit with the families that I work with, and in fact, I've once had to present with them and I needed to put the context of the program. And the context of the program, this is a program for families in disadvantaged areas. And I felt deeply uncomfortable because I'm standing next to these women who I respect, who I care about deeply, and who I don't want to stand there putting a negative connotation on. And I think we really need to say, disadvantaged in what way? And in fact, is it a disadvantage to not be a white middle class person? In lots of ways, I am a white middle class person, and I feel sadly lacking next to a whole lot of people that I work with. I think we run the risk when we think of marginalised, again, it means pushed to the edge. It means doesn't really matter. It means it's the bit off the edge that can be cropped. That's not right. Vulnerable by whose standards? Many of the families that I work with who other people would consider to be vulnerable, and bureaucratically we would put in that category, are strong. They're survivors. They understand how to operate in their world. Like everybody else, they have questions. Like everybody else, there is more that they can learn. Like everybody else, they care about their families and their children. They want the best for their children. We run the risk of trying to create families who in fact are the vast majority, who we call vulnerable, disadvantaged, marginalised, into the image of the white middle class person, which would we would lose so much by doing that. On a personal level, it undermines people, but on a societal level, it would bland our society to take that away. And I think there's so much disrespect in judging people as a negative, where everybody can be judged in a negative light, and everybody can be seen in a really positive light. Everybody has strengths. Everybody has competencies. Everybody has challenges. Everybody has great beauty that they bring to the world, great richness that they bring to the world. And we run the risk of pigeonholing people into doesn't matter, or into needs to be worked on to improve, and to say if you live in this place, or if your skin is this colour, or if your income is this, or your background is that you've been in foster homes, or if we only see that as a community, we're so much the poorer.